From Nazi soldiers on meth to the Taliban funding jihad through selling heroin, the history of drugs and the history of warfare have been deeply intertwined for centuries. Yet this relationship between drugs and war has almost never been properly examined. Until now. I'm J.S. Raffaelli. I've spent years writing about drugs. Why people take them, and why our governments chose to declare war on them. Vice, we make a lot of films about drugs. But in this show, I get to dig a bit deeper. I get to talk to fellow expert drug nerds about their research into the crazy world of mind-altering substances.
A one-liner would be drugs made war, and war made drugs.
Peter Andreas is a writer and political scientist. In his new book, he looks at the relationship between war and 6 key drugs: amphetamine, cocaine, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and opium. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
There are drugs which are illegal, which we're constantly told are very dangerous, but armies are dishing them out to their own soldiers to get them to fight harder. Let's talk about that for a minute.
One of the most important relationships between drugs and war is the actual use of drugs by combatants, by those who do the work of war. And it's very stressful, anxiety-ridden work. So it's no surprise. I mean, I take caffeine for my job, but soldiering is a much more difficult and stressful job. So no surprise that throughout the centuries, they've used various psychoactive substances, often actually pushed by states themselves. This ranges from, getting tobacco and alcohol rations in earlier eras, no longer as fashionable to do that with soldiers, to now getting prescribed medications that, essentially, one way to look at it is in Vietnam, soldiers self-medicated. U.S. soldiers self-medicated with heroin and marijuana and so on. But now they actually much more access to prescription medications doled out by the government itself.
So people shouldn't underestimate the scale of this. I mean, when one looks back to, say, the German army during World War II, and just how hopped up on methamphetamine they were.
One way to look at it is it's a war on sleep, right? And so if you can keep your soldiers energized, motivated, less needing of rest, less needing of sleep, you have an advantage. And the Blitzkrieg itself was, a core dimension of it was lightning strike was what it was, and it happened to be speed. So we look at, importance of logistics and fuel and food for an army, but I think we also need to look at the role of psychoactive substances as well.
Well, and likewise, it wasn't just the Germans. The Japanese gave their soldiers, especially like kamikaze pilots, and the Americans and the Brits were all on these pep pills.
You're right. The Japanese, think about a combatant that needs a pepper-upper. It would be a kamikaze pilot, right? And so, but it wasn't just the soldiers either. At home, Japan, to ramp up production, to keep the war machine going, the sort of total war mobilization required also giving workers meth to work overtime to keep the military machinery going.
And that's an interesting thing about the illicit market, right? Because I'm really interested in how when drugs are made illegal, the business of war and the business of crime start to meet.
The trend one sees is that the more legal the drug, the more it is served as a basis of financing of governments, of legal, regimes. And the more criminalized the drug, the more it's become a profit center for insurgents, militias, gangs, terrorists, and so on. But then there's that murky in between, as you point out, where for geopolitical reasons, governments at various times overlook the drug dealing activities of allies for immediate, very pragmatic reasons. We saw this during the Cold War in Afghanistan, but we also saw it more recently in Afghanistan as well. We would overlook, supporting warlords and so on in Afghanistan who are involved in drugs, or the government in Afghanistan, deep drug-related corruption, but overlooking it for the war on terror.
And this continues through sort of Central America in the 80s, right, with the various civil wars there and how the CIA got involved.
It's a murky story, but in some ways perfectly clear that if your priority is fighting communism, you might put fighting cocaine as a secondary issue. And if some of your less somewhat unsavory allies in fighting communism on the ground, so contra, combatants in Honduras or Costa Rica, if they're also dabbling in the drug trade, you're not going to prioritize that as an issue.
But so sticking with this business of war, right? It is quite shocking, like how much warfare has been paid for throughout human history by governments taxing different kinds of drugs, right?
You often don't have direct tax revenue through, national income tax back then. So you do indirect taxes on commodities. So tobacco becomes hugely important. Taxing tobacco, taxing tea, taxing coffee, taxing alcohol. If you add those all up, and I haven't even gone to illegal drugs, right? Because we're talking about, legitimate governments taxing stuff to pay for their war machine. I mean, then we talk about narco states today. One could say really the first narco state was Britain. In fact, it was a narco empire. I mean, if you just think about the importance of tea and opium.
So I really wanted to get into this narco state versus narco empire thing, right? And I'm really interested in that.
I mean, one way to look at this historically is no modern day so-called drug cartel has ever had the power and influence in the drug trade as the British East India Company. Never has, never will. I mean, there's an extraordinary, moment in history when it just dominated the opium trade. And it ultimately contributes to the outbreak of interstate warfare, a hugely lopsided conflict between Britain and China. China loses, and the floodgates open even more to opium. But then there's the second opium war, where China basically throws in the towel and legalizes the product. And then, interestingly enough, import substitution strategy was, what? If we can't beat Indian supplies, we'll just produce the stuff locally.
And likewise, in another historical example of this importance of taxation warfare is that America basically wouldn't exist without rum and tobacco, right?
The colonies were an important part of their economy was smuggling, and the most important smuggled commodity was molasses from the French West Indies. And why am I talking about molasses when we're talking about drugs? Well, molasses was the crucial ingredient for rum. And this was, crucial for the triangle trade. You export rum to West Africa for slaves. The slaves are brought forcibly to the plantations in the Caribbean. Then you bring more molasses back. And what was happening is much of the molasses trade was in violation of British trade rules. They weren't paying taxes on this stuff. And the British weren't, for a long time, not particularly interested in enforcing the rules. But when they did crack down and indicate a serious interest in enforcement, the merchants not only balked, but they actually, raised arms and revolted. This sounds very provocative and controversial, but John Adams himself, one of our founding fathers, I'm paraphrasing here, said, after the revolution, said, we should not blush to recognize the importance of molasses in the American Revolution.
I think we should make clear, right? Brass tacks, the most important drug with a relationship to warfare is alcohol, right? And the scale of this has to be made clear, just how pissed up were most soldiers in most battles through most of human history.
I mean, for much of human history, it's okay if your soldiers are a little buzzed from alcohol. It makes, steals their nerves. It's liquid courage is what we called it, right? And, help them in World War I, but going back centuries. But as war has become more complicated, more skilled positions, right? The extraordinarily expensive machinery to operate. The tolerance for alcohol on the battlefield has radically decreased for major modern militaries, right?
And I think with the cigarette, there's something very interesting as well, like in terms of how wars and armies have spread the use of certain drugs and drugs in certain forms, right? Because it was World War I which spread the cigarette.
It starts with the Romans actually spreading wine to the rest of Europe. I mean, France is this famous wine-producing country, but who brought wine to France? It was Roman conquest. Before that, they were drinking beer. Bordeaux, the port, was founded by Romans, after all. But then fast forward to more recent centuries, absolutely tobacco, especially in the 20th century. The globalization of cigarette use followed, the proliferation of soldiers across the world.
Say with World War II, you had the Coca-Cola company kind of deeply ingrained with the American military, and the American military actually building international Coca-Cola plants.
Yes, Coca-Cola was so valued by U.S. soldiers that rather than the difficult logistics of exporting the stuff from the U.S. to the soldiers deployed all over the world, was actually set up plants, bottling plants at military bases. It's not just Coca-Cola. I mean, tea for the British, right? The importance of the tea cars in London during the bombing of London. Coffee rations. Instant coffee was an instant hit on the battlefield. I mean, it really didn't take off until it really reached the front lines and then endured. I mean, some things that have been institutionalized now have a war link, so the tea break or the coffee break, and so on. Very much part of keeping a productive workforce going strong for the war effort.
So now I'd like to move on to the actual war on drugs, right? And this is a really interesting sort of bleed of the military into civilian life. And I think that's a really important process to talk about.
What's important about the war on drugs and why it fits in this story is that war on drugs went from being war as metaphor, say Nixon declaring a war on drugs, to actually deploying troops to fight drugs, which frankly, Nixon didn't send in the Marines to fight drugs. It was, George Bush Sr. who invaded Panama in December of '89 to depose Noriega on drug trafficking charges, right? And the war has become against drugs has become literal in the sense that a country such as Mexico, there's been more drug-related deaths in Mexico since 2006 than there have been in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. Yet, people who study war, Mexico's typically not on the radar screen as a sort of major war zone.
And I think even within the United States itself, could you describe the process by which civilian policing and military engagement has sort of bled into each other, and police have started to come to almost resemble military forces?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because there is a domestic dimension to this. I mean, actual deployment of U.S. troops to fight drugs is prohibited domestically. You can't send troops to Providence or Chicago or whatnot to go after drug dealers. That's not allowed. But what is allowed is the proliferation of say SWAT teams, basically militarized special police units that increasingly resemble military forces. You can't really explain why so many police forces around the country have their own SWAT teams if you take out drugs. So there's been essentially a militarization of policing domestically and civilianization of soldiering.
So let's talk for a minute about the war on drugs and the relationship between insurgency warfare and say the cocaine trade in South and Central America?
Yeah, I mean, this is a clear example where the war on drugs is so militarized that it overlaps and blurs with counterinsurgencies. It's no surprise that a government like Colombia is going to basically use the tools of the drug war to fight its counterinsurgency campaign. The politics of this internationally, though, are that the U.S. Is perfectly willing to give Colombia lots of anti-drug money. Under Plan Colombia, I mean, really, extraordinarily expensive operation. I think it was the largest U.S. military aid operation outside of the Middle East, and in Plan Colombia in the around 2000. But the Colombians basically used it to fight insurgents than to fight drugs. So the war on drugs and the war on insurgents became inescapably intertwined. But the Colombian government's priority was clearly fighting the guerrillas, not the drugs. I mean, basically, the insurgency is largely tamed, but Colombia remains the world's largest exporter of cocaine. So fighting drugs arguably took a backseat to fighting guerrillas, and policymakers in the U.S. to a significant extent were willing to turn a blind eye to this, especially after 9/11, because after that, suddenly the insurgents in Colombia, which had been operating for decades, were considered part of the war on terror.
Right, well, taking up this theme of the war on drugs and the war on terror, we've just seen American military sort of catastrophe in Afghanistan. And looking back over 20 years of America's engagement there, or more, 40 years, I mean, one can't escape the role of the opium market and the illegal heroin trade, right?
Really, the important move was a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And during the 80s, desperate Afghan farmers increasingly turned to opium production. And after the Soviets leave, the Western powers, especially the US, essentially abandons the country. Afghanistan becomes the world's largest producer of opium. The Taliban's a major beneficiary of that as they take power in the 1990s. And interestingly, the US then invades Afghanistan, and the story of the post-invasion years is Afghanistan production surges to record levels, with arguably all sides profiting from this business. And now fast forward to today, the economy's in total shambles. Foreign aid's been obviously cut off. Sanctions are imposed predictably on the new Taliban regime. And guess what? I have no doubt that the opium economy and the illicit economy in Afghanistan in general are going to become a huge source of survival for Afghan.
Okay, what's the future of drugs and warfare?
I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm reluctant to make predictions, but one prediction I can pretty safely make is that this drugs and war relationship is alive and well and will remain so. Drugs and war have gone, hand in hand for a long time. So in the absence of a war-free world, we're not going to have a drug-free world, right? The last thing I'll say, and I don't really discuss it in the book, but I mention at the very end, is war itself has drug-like qualities in terms of the sort of adrenaline rush that comes from war. There's lots of memoirs, war memoirs, and recollections that describe the rush of war in strikingly drug-like terms. Right? I don't know if you remember the last scene in the movie The Hurt Locker, where he comes back from Iraq and he's bored to death strolling around the grocery store, and he re-enlists.
Yeah, it's like the opening of Apocalypse Now. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, or in fact, all of Apocalypse Now.
Right.
Yes.